Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Welcome to the webinar series, Reparations, Remembering, Repairing, and Reimagining. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as a Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the General Board of Church and Society. And I will be moderating this webinar along with my colleagues, Reverend Katie Monforte, Kurt Adams, and Emily Newman. Thank you for being with us today and for your patience as we rescheduled the first in this webinar series to July 19th, where we will be examining the history of our unjust past of slavery and the continuum of harm and the case for reparations in HR 40. More information will be shared at the end of this webinar. There has been a renewed focus on reparations for the descendants of the enslaved in the United States. And as this webinar series delves deeper into the why and the how of reparations, we want to take a moment today to acknowledge the other examples of reparations in the United States: Native Americans, the Kingdom of Hawaii, Japanese Americans, and the first ever reparations offered by a city to descendants of slaves in the United States, Evanston, Illinois. Before I introduce you to our great panelists for today, I want to share the agenda for this session. During the panel discussion, feel free to type a question for our panelists. And to do so, please enter your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. At the end of our panel discussion, we will enter a Q&A time with Reverend Katie Monforte. We will close with announcements and a closing prayer offered by Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow, the General Secretary of GBCS. I am thrilled and honored to introduce you to our panel for today. Reverend Chebon Kernell is the Executive Director of the Native American Comprehensive Plan for the United Methodist Church. He is an ordained elder in the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference and previously served as Executive Secretary of Native American and Indigenous Ministries at the General Board of Global Ministries. He is a member of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and is of Muscogee Creek heritage. His Excellency Leon Kaulahao CU is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Hawaiian Kingdom and serves as a key strategist and spokesman for the kingdom. He has been involved since the early 1970s in the movement to reinstate the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent country. His duties as foreign minister are to normalize and resume diplomatic relations with other states and international bodies, including reviving existing treaties and agreements. Minister CU was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for his work in promoting independence for West Papua. Reverend Grace Imathiu is the senior pastor of Evanston First United Methodist Church in Evanston, Illinois since 2018. Previously, she pastored congregations from Green Bay, Wisconsin to Nairobi, Kenya. She served as a church planter, a superintendent minister, an urban minister, and is a sought-out preacher. She uses sermons as a tool of justice at the intersection of religion, race, sexuality, and gender. Reverend Michael Yoshii is an ordained clergy in the United Methodist Church. He retired in July of 2020 after serving for 32 years as a pastor of Buena Vista United Methodist Church in Alameda, California, an historically Japanese American congregation. During his pastorate, the church was a hub for organizing on racial equity, affordable housing, renters' rights, LGBTQ+ inclusiveness, and immigrant rights. He has served the Global Church on the General Board of Global Ministries and was the founder of the United Methodist Kairos Response, an international network advocating for Palestinian human rights. Reverend Yoshii currently serves on the International Campaign for Human Rights in the Philippines Global Council and is the co-chair of the Friends of Wadi Fuquin, an interfaith partnership with the Palestinian Muslim village in the occupied West Bank. Thank you all for being here. We are so excited for the rich conversation that we are about to have. So the first set of questions are for Minister CU. Many joining us today might not be aware that the Hawaiian Kingdom is illegally occupied by the United States. Can you provide for us a short history of the events surrounding the occupation, the Apology Bill of 1993, and the struggle for sovereignty, and how would sovereignty impact Native Hawaiians today? Please, Mr. Siu, if you can unmute. Thank you.
There we go. All right. Aloha kako. Very good to be here today with these distinguished panelists. I am from the Hawaiian Kingdom. And most people think of Hawaii as the state of Hawaii, but it's actually the existing and continuing Hawaiian Kingdom, which was established, actually since time immemorial, but formally created into a country in 1810 when King Kamehameha the Great finally united all the islands. And then 1843, when the Hawaiian Kingdom was recognized as a sovereign state, as an equal sovereign, along with all of the European countries, the doctrine of discovery countries. We became part of that partnership, or part of that club, that exclusive club of sovereign countries. We actually were the first non-Eurocentric country to become recognized as a sovereign state. So prior to Japan or China or anyone else, Hawaii was actually recognized as a sovereign state, which meant we avoided the doctrine of discovery policies being applied to our islands. So Hawaii never went through that period of time, or that takeover through the doctrine of discovery, not at least at the beginning. So Hawaii actually in 1820, we just celebrated last year the 200th anniversary of the landing of the first missionaries from New England, and they landed and found a country in quite a bit of chaos because of the encroachment and the interactions between the West and Hawaii at the time, particularly the diseases that was decimating our people. So by the 1850s, roughly half of the population of Hawaii had died from diseases. By the 1890s, 90% of our people passed on because of diseases. So only 10% of our original population remained. So the missionaries came at a very opportune time because Hawaii was in this turmoil. And the missionaries came, of course, to bring the good news, the gospel, but also to minister to the people and to bring some sense of relief. And so to bring some health and education, etc. The Hawaiian people, from the top down, initially starting with the great chiefs as well as the king, all accepted the gospel and accepted Jesus Christ. And by the 1850s, about 30 years after the missionaries initially arrived, Hawaii had become virtually a Christian nation. It was actually declared a Christian nation in 1840. And then in the 50s, it was during a census, it was registered that 96% of the population of Hawaii were Christians. So they had abandoned the old religion and had embraced Christianity, which had a tremendous effect on bringing peace and order to the Hawaiian Islands. As I said, it was already recognized by that time as a sovereign state, a civilized sovereign state. So 1850s, the sugar industry began to grow, which brought quite a bit of conflict because sugar needed more lands. During the American Civil War, all of a sudden Hawaiian sugar became a premium item because of the southern states of the United States. Of course, that was the sugar producing areas, and they had seceded. And so the northern states needed to get sugar from someplace, and Hawaii was one of the places that they turned to, so that there was a full-on boom in the sugar industry. And many of the sugar planters became very wealthy during those few years of the Civil War. And they had expanded greatly into the Hawaiian lands. They had basically found all kinds of ways to acquire Hawaiian lands legally or illegally. mostly illegally. And they created these great sugar plantations, but they were at a loss for workers because there were so few Hawaiians left. And so they started to import, they began to bring to bring sugar workers in from Asia mostly. And so that's how the Asian population started to grow in Hawaii. And the Asians worked in the sugar plantations for a number of years, and they eventually moved out of the plantations and became part of the business society in Hawaii. And then just basically were upward mobile. And whereas the Hawaiians still resided on the fringes of society at this point. In 1893, the conditions had gotten to the point where the sugar planters were really losing monies, and they were very worried about this because the Civil War had ended, of course, a number of years prior, and the Southern sugar came online, and that dropped the prices for the Hawaiian sugar and the demand. And so then the Hawaiian sugar as a foreign commodity had to be, was actually, there were tariffs levied by the United States against Hawaiian sugar to be imported. And so the local sugar growers, who were all white men, by the way, who owned the plantations, mostly Americans, a few nationals from other countries, but they conspired to create a situation in which they could sell their sugar at a more profitable rate. And so they decided it would be best for Hawaii to become annexed to the United States. And so from the 1880s, they plotted, and in 1893, they finally hatched, or they finally implemented their plot, which was to depose the Queen and take over the government. And they did so with the help of the United States, who at that time was coveting Pearl Harbor as a naval base. And so the United States had entered into a period of what we call manifest destiny. And this was their first opportunity to exercise this manifest destiny. And President William McKinley did so. And they sought to annex the United States because the Hawaiian government had been overthrown and taken over by insurgents in 1893. So in 1898, there was a real strong effort in the first year of McKinley's administration, the strong effort to annex the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. But the efforts failed because the Congress would not ratify the annexation of a foreign country without the country's people's consent. But there are forces within the US Congress, as well as in the administration of the United States, that conspired to find a different way. And so they did. They passed a joint resolution of Congress. And then in that joint resolution, presumed to have annexed the Hawaiian Islands. And so this was carried out with the puppet government that was in Hawaii at the time. And so an annexation occurred through a joint resolution of Congress, which is it's an unlawful way of annexing a foreign country. Nevertheless, the United States had the firepower because they had already sent many troops. Well, they had already started to occupy Pearl Harbor for the last few years and had sent troops to prosecute the war in the Philippines, first against Spain and then against the Filipinos. So the overthrow took place in 1893, 1898. The joint resolution of Congress called the Newlands Resolution was passed. And then 1898, the United States just acted to seize or to take over the Hawaiian Islands. And that's where we've been. And then they formed the territory of Hawaii. Hawaii became a territory of the United States, again, unlawfully. And then eventually in 1959, Hawaii was made into a state of the United States. Each one of those actions were unlawful because the initial act, 1893, the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, was an unlawful act. And everything that followed, the United States actually formulated or fabricated excuses as to why Hawaii was part of the United States. So we didn't discover this really until the 1970s when things started to unfold. In 1993, the United States apologized for its wrongdoing. In 1893, 100 years prior, President Grover Cleveland also apologized profusely for taking over a foreign country through force and with no legitimate means. But in 1893, President Clinton reiterated that apology and basically admitted that Hawaii had seized, the United States had seized Hawaii unlawfully. So that was a great day for us. We thought, okay, finally, we'll be able to restore our nation as a sovereign country. But the United States had no intention of doing so. So we've been struggling ever since to hold the United States to its apology, to say, when is the next shoe going to drop? You know, you've apologized, and now you need to make right that the wrongdoing that had occurred over 128 years. So that's where we are right now today. There has really been nothing that has emerged from that apology, except for nice words and some token gestures of the apology. But today, headlines in the news is about broken promises and about the seizure of lands and the return of lands and the failure of the United States, even though lands were returned in 1995. The failure of the United States to actually return those lands, and they kept it under their own control and farmed it out to developers and the like. So we are still in a huge struggle in the Hawaiian Islands to right a historical wrong and to restore our nation. So that's where we are.
Thank you so much for that brief kind of history that I think many of us probably heard for the first time, and how it's so just tied to something so simple and something that we use every day, like sugar.
Can't hear you. Can't hear you right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The follow-up question is that you've outlined beautifully just the ways that missionaries played a positive role in Hawaii, but we also know that Protestant missionaries often played a detrimental role in promoting and justifying colonialism and occupation. And just here, if you can share a little bit about what role did missionaries play in the occupation of Hawaii?
Yes. Okay, very good. Yeah, as you said, initially the missionaries played a very positive role. And once Christianity was established in Hawaii, there was no need for the mission to be here anymore. So they disbanded. But many of the missionaries remained, and of course their children remained in Hawaii because they became Hawaiian subjects, loyal to the Hawaiian Kingdom. And so it was the children and grandchildren of these missionaries that actually built the sugar industry, or were key to building the sugar industry, because they were people from here. They were Hawaiian citizens. And so they became the big traders and mercenaries within merchants, let's say, within the Hawaiian Islands. So at that point, the church became quite divided among the pastors, who were still mostly white pastors who were descendants of missionaries and others that were brought in, and the congregation, which was predominantly Hawaiian, of course. So at the time of the overthrow, there was a huge outcry from the Hawaiian people protesting the overthrow in 1893 and support for the Queen. But the church itself, the main denomination, which is now the United Church of Christ, so this congregational denomination that had established itself in Hawaii, its leaders sided with the insurgents and sent letters to the United States, basically accusing Hawaiians as being subpar, the queen as being a savage and all of that. Now, the ironic thing was that the queen was a Christian queen, and she had been named even just the year before as the most outstanding Christian woman in Hawaii. And she was a choir leader and a Bible teacher at her church, Kaulahao. She was also the queen, of course, and she was a great composer. She's the one who composed Aloha Oi, as well as many, many other songs. And the Hawaiians had produced thousands of hymns during the 19th century. So Hawaii was a very vibrant Christian community and society, but a few leaders in the church actually sided with the insurgents and wrote very damaging letters to the U.S. Congress and to the President of the United States, supporting the overthrow and later supporting the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. So the church got a very, very bad black eye. Now, the congregation actually, in some instances, actually ousted the pastors because it was a congregational form of governance at the church level. So they ousted some of the pastors who were most egregious about betraying the nation. But ever since then, the church has received a black eye. So in 1993, the UCC, United Church of Christ, issued an apology, even prior to the United States apology. They issued an apology for their role in the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and also said that they would make some form of reparations. A couple of years later, they set aside approximately $4 million in cash as well as in property to be used for that reconciliation. We've seen very little of it actually used toward reconciliation. Much of it has been used internally in the church itself, but not really toward reconciliation. So we're still waiting for that. And that word reconciliation, by the way, was the key word used by the United States in its apology, and saying that they would convene forms of reconciliation. And we are still waiting. 28 years later, after that apology, we're still waiting for whatever reconciliation the United States intends.
Thank you so much. And another question that we have for you. In 1995, state and federal legislation pledged to provide reparations by returning ancestral lands to Native Hawaiian people. And more than 25 years later, the federal government still owes land reparations. This morning, as I was driving in, NPR was actually just talking about that. So it seems like it's in conversation these days. And you mentioned in a previous conversation that we had that more and more offenses are being brought to light of the malfeasance and abuses suffered under US occupation.
Yes.
The uncovering of these events and the delay in justice given more credence to the need for reparations, and what does the reparation movement look like currently, and is the church taking part in this movement?
Yes, okay. And to answer your question, yes, the church is taking part. The Christian church has awoken. So in fact, next week at the general conference, I'm not sure what it's called, of the UCC, is taking up a resolution to get serious about the reparations for the Hawaiian Islands. The United States continues to play games with the Hawaiian people as far as withholding lands that have been designated to be returned. Then they withheld it, and all kinds of malfeasances, as the word you used. And so we're always struggling with that. Right now, in front of Governor Ige's on his desk is a bill that was passed by the state legislature that would be even more egregious toward Hawaiian lands. Basically, it gives the state the power to make 99-year leases to developers, 99-year leases of Hawaiian lands to the developers, to developers, which really essentially is like transferring lands into their hands because of the length of time. Anyway, so the Hawaiian people have been fighting that. Now, we've been fighting many, many battles, and most of them has been over land since the 1970s. In many of the cases, we actually have prevailed, but it's only been a defensive kind of a battle. In other words, we've only tried to prevent more damage from being done. But in the meantime, a lot of damage continues, particularly the overdevelopment taking place on lands that should be governed by Hawaiians and should be controlled by Hawaiians. So the tourism industry, the agricultural industry before, now and the military industry, the industrial complex, are just running roughshod over Hawaiians, and Hawaiians are continually being marginalized and pushed out, so that the largest number of homeless in Hawaii are Hawaiians, who ironically have a right to all of these lands. But under the present system of the United States and the state of Hawaii, who are the trustees of our lands, we have been pushed out because we don't have access to our own lands.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I'm going to move forward now into other communities.
Oh, may I add one more thing?
Yes.
So in the area of reconciliation, the United States, of course, has not made any moves for that, but we have. We are saying the only thing that can settle this question is the return of the Hawaiian Kingdom into the Hawaiian people's hands, into that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. It was never extinguished. And the Hawaiian people have come to realize this and have now risen up to claim our lands back again. And international law, as well as domestic laws, all confirm that this is the right thing to do. When a thief steals something, then the right thing to do to repair the injury would be to return that. And so no matter how long that thief has had it, and no longer how many hands it's transferred to, it's still the property and the kuleana, the responsibility of the people of Hawaii. And so we are demanding that those lands be returned. In all of the battles we've taken over the last few years, we've actually increased our victories. There was a huge battle over Mauna Kea, which is a mountain where an international conglomerate wanted to build, an international consortium wanted to build a 30-meter telescope. And we resisted it for 10 years and finally had to actually go up there and block the start of the construction. And that was successful because we delayed it well enough so that we couldn't proceed. And so it's right now it's in limbo, but it's not going to move anywhere as far as that development. So we won that large battle, and it was a very visible battle and internationally covered, similar to the pipeline in North Dakota. I can't remember the name of that, Standing Rock. Yes. Anyway, so Mauna Kea became a symbol of our nation moving forward to reclaim our lands and to establish the fact that it doesn't go any further at this point. So we are locked in these battles, but we are actually prevailing, and our nation is becoming more and more encouraged that we can prevail and that we will become a free country once again.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the transition that you've provided for our next set of questions that go, and these questions are for Reverend Chebon Kernell. The wrongs of the United States government against indigenous communities are intricately bound with the formation of this country. What many people of faith may be less aware of is the culpability of the church in the harm done to Native peoples. Can you share with us ways in which the church participated in inflicting harm?
Excuse me. Thank you, Amy. When we think about the history of the development of this country, the relationship it had with various denominations of Christian missionaries, we kind of have to get a snapshot of what this world looked like prior to the development of the US. We think about the population of indigenous peoples being 100% here, in what is now the United States. Depending on what type of scholarly work you look at, we try to look at the populations. It can range anywhere from 10 million all the way to over 100 million, just kind of depending on the scholarship and the work. Well, just a few years ago, the University of Wisconsin published an estimate of about 56 million indigenous persons on this continent. Now, this is prior to the development of the United States. During the formation of this country, during the time of when we see stories that we call Trail of Tears stories, displacement of tribal communities onto reservations, all of these types of things, communities had been through war. They too had been sold into slavery as well. We perished because of diseases, all kinds of things for going on about 200 years. In the mid-19th century, because of all of these forms of displacement, that population of 56 million hovered around 244,000. And if you were to do the math of indigenous peoples there in North America, that means that because of all of that chaos, that 99.996% of the population of indigenous peoples did not survive. Those Native American peoples that you see today are the descendants of that 0.004% of survivors. Now, the numbers have rebounded over the next 170 years or so, but it was at that point in time in the mid-19th century when you start to see the most egregious acts in the relationship between Native American peoples and the development of this country, because the United States began to develop its policy of assimilation, and even terminology such as assimilation or annihilation is in government documents where communities were not given any choice but to give up a way of life that had been in existence for thousands upon thousands of years. Even my own ancestors, the Muskogee people, we believe that our birthplace was in what is now the southeastern part of the United States, near what is called Macon, Georgia, where you find the Okmulgee mounds, where our elders and our ancient ones said this was the birthplace of our people. And it's estimated that in that location alone, human existence has been there for around 13,000 years. Now, if I do the math correctly as well, this country is only 240 something, give or take, a year old. So when the United States is over 500 years old, then perhaps it can talk to our indigenous communities here as equals. But until that point, we're the ones that have taken care of the land, have lived in harmony with this land. It was during that time in the 20th century the 19th century, when our numbers were so low that we saw that government policy instituted, but we also saw the birthing of what became known as boarding schools or residential schools, or the terminology I also use in international conferences is re-education centers, because it became a part of US policy to take our children across the country to locations where basically everything that was deemed indigenous about their identity was demonized and even forbidden. To speak their language, to practice, to dress, to have long hair, all of that was forbidden. And it was during that time that we really see the most egregious of actions, because not only were children taken from homes, not only were they abused, but they suffered in ways that we cannot even begin to imagine. And it was during this time period, which lasted, roughly into the 20th century as well, that we saw the most damage done to our communities. So the survivors of those various forms of displacement now had to suffer an additional trauma. It is during that time that, where I see is the most harmful impact of the relationship of the church and government to Native peoples, because it was during that time that the schools, they were run in a militaristic fashion. The one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, formulated by I forget his rank and title, but Pratt was his last name. They were modeled all across the country in the same fashion. Some of those boarding schools were actually run by Christian denominations, even the United Methodist Church, or the Methodist Church at that time, were volunteers, were missionaries, were persons who basically ran the schools. So regardless of whether there were good intentions or not, regardless of what had happened, there is a culpability that was there in watching this cultural genocide take place decade after decade after decade, even to the point where some of these practices still went into the mid 20th century. I can remember the first church that I served in Pawnee, Oklahoma, here as a young student pastor, where I heard stories of some of the members of my congregation who went to the Pawnee boarding school, which was just around the corner from our Methodist church there. And they shared stories about how they too were punished for using the Pawnee language, where they were punished for, having that cultural identity. And the preference that was always demanded from them to look at was a Eurocentric Christian perspective, that to be a productive citizen, you had to be one who converted, that these other ways of spirituality, these other ways of communicating were not going to be fruitful. And so when we think about that, it's under my opinion that that's probably the most detrimental time in history, because we were at our most vulnerable state as Indigenous peoples of the United States. And it was at that point where what identity we had left after all of the displacement that we had been through, that it became under attack. And so we saw many of our children perish. We saw many of our children try to run away and go back home. And we even saw many of our families, they would uproot their camps and move closer to the actual boarding school so that they would be near their loved ones there. What we are just now beginning to figure out is how deep that trauma went and is gone, because we're just now starting to put the pieces back together of what really happened during that era in the boarding school times. We're just now putting back the pieces and realizing what level of abuse took place, of physical, verbal, mental, and even we're starting to begin to realize there was even sexual abuse that took place in these school settings. And what I share with communities across the country is that there's not a family in Native American communities that someone wasn't impacted by going to a boarding school. Somebody somewhere, a member of our families had survived that experience. Even myself, all of my grandparents were persons who went to boarding schools here in Oklahoma and various places. So it's something that has, we're all a part of that. And the unfortunate reality is that many are just now beginning to realize this is a part of our history of the United States. I remember also speaking at a congregation here in Oklahoma several years ago, and I mentioned boarding schools. Not that the sermon wasn't all about that, it was about other things as well. But I had a person come up to me afterwards and say, I taught US history for 20-something years, and I never knew that this boarding school era existed. I never knew this even happened. And that's the reality that we face when we begin to educate people, because we're just now starting to reconstruct what our identity can look like post-trauma. And so what I would say is that that's probably one of the things that we try to share with people when we think about, when we come up and look at the endangered nature of our indigenous languages, the endangered nature of our indigenous spiritualities, and even some of the work that we do around missing and murdered and indigenous women. It goes back to this undermining of one's right to exist, the undermining of one's self-determination for their own being, for their own community, for their own people and family. It goes back to this point in time.
Thank you so much for the response. And as a follow-up, and you've mentioned a lot of this already, but about a month ago, the remains of 215 Native American students were found at a boarding school in Canada. And reports that show that United States had twice as many as such schools. And Methodists were one of the mainline denominations, like you mentioned, that took part in supervising these boarding schools where practices of indoctrination and cultural genocide were known to be carried out. So a question that I have for you is, what can the church do to take responsibility and provide reparations? And what does reparations look like from the federal level for all of these years of harm?
I think the first step with me, it's always going to be acknowledging the truth, because we are still going through so many levels of negligent avoidance, I guess you could say, and not even realizing that this is a moment in time that we still haven't quite gotten out of just yet. You know, when we think about the Kamloops residential school in Canada, that Canada, now I'm not going to defend the Canadian government by any means. There's more work to be done. It's a colonizing entity, just like the United States. But at least, you know, over the past 10 years, they did have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that went through and examined the testimonies from survivors of various boarding schools. They have been trying to do the work to start putting the pieces together of examining what could reconciliation look like. Here in the United States, we haven't done that at all. We haven't had a corporate acknowledgement from the US federal government in any capacity that can at least get us to a point of acknowledging this took place and there are survivors out there that still have testimony. Now, we've done that on our own with various grassroots movements who have kind of began to document some of the stories that they've heard. But that's the reality. And even since, Amy, you mentioned that the 215 that were found, an additional 174 graves have been found at 3 other residential schools since that announcement. And this has only been like 3 weeks ago. So my fear is that the more that we look, the more that harm we're going to find. But we have to get to that point before we can build something now and say, here's what we hope for the future for all of our people, so that we don't engage in this harm anymore. So what I believe is the church can be a place, if they choose to, and I've said this to our Council of Bishops, I've said this to congregations, I've said this to annual conferences, if we choose to, we can be a powerful catalyst for healing by simply opening our doors and listening, by simply saying, we will not engage in this harm anymore, and we won't even ask you to explain why you're upset. We will simply be here for you to affirm everything that you're going through in this cycle of healing and reconstructing our identity as Indigenous peoples. And in many cases, what we tend to do is, you know, I was on a webinar yesterday and I used this term, white-splaining. You know, we tend to reinterpret what we're hearing. Say, oh, well, was it really that bad? Did we not, you know, educate the children? They tend to kind of retell what we're saying. You know, we do that far too many times. And we simply just shake our heads, pat somebody on the back, and we don't change anything. Churches have to be a catalyst for change. They are in positions of I'm not going to say authority, but positions of privilege where they can advocate to, whether it's federal government, whether it's institutions, to help say, let's be honest and let's start to tell the truth so that we can build a better future for our communities. And even as I'm talking, in the back of my mind, not even associated with boarding schools, I'm thinking about all of these Native American sacred sites, grave sites that have been broken into by robbers looting the remains of all of our ancestors. That's still a problem going on right now. You know, I've been in consultation with military institutions who are trying to protect these lands, and people are breaking into them all the time, disrespecting sacred sites. So my hope is that the church can be one who knows that this is going on and can start to be in a relationship with our Indigenous people, saying, what can we do now to end this harm? And so that's what my hope is. You know, and this can be done in a host of ways: affirming the presence of Native American peoples in your community, affirming the presence of Native American leaders in your in your churches and in your annual conferences. If not, finding those persons who you can walk in relationship with that may be outside the boundaries of the Christian faith and Methodist Church.
Thank you so much. And I actually watched you in the webinar yesterday, and that was really great. So thank you for that. One question that I have: on September 21st, 2019, at John Stewart United Methodist Church in Upper Sandusky, Ohio, there was a ceremony that I believe you were also present there as well, giving land that the Methodist Church had held in trust back to the Wyandotte people. Can you share the history of how this land was given in trust to Methodists and the journey taken to see its return?
And I wish I had a greater hand in that, but a lot of the scholarship went to David Scott, who was one of my colleagues at the time at Global Ministries, who did a lot of the research. But just as the same with a lot of missionary entities, Global Ministries, the missionary arm of the United Methodist Church right now, has title to all of these kind of missionary sites all across the country. And so this John Stewart Methodist Church and the cemetery that's located right next to it was kind of the same instance where the church, just by virtue of it being a mission, had the deed to that land. Now, time went on where I don't think anyone ever challenged, the ownership of that, and even connected the dots with the Wyandotte ancestors being buried in those two locations. I think there were two separate sites in the upper Sandusky area that no one really questioned it. So as we began our work at Global Ministries and even the denomination, starting with its act of repentance era, when it wanted to enter into a moment of right relationship with indigenous peoples, we began to examine these places, because if we're going to ever start to entertain any type of conversation of reconciliation, or even enter the room of reparations, that for us, it always is going to begin with the returning of land. The returning of land to the communities with no strings attached. And so the powers that be, from whatever may have you, we began to examine it. We began to be in conversation with the various Wyandotte groups, because there are about 3 or 4 that stayed in the different places across the country where they were displaced from. We had little groups here all the way down to Oklahoma. So they began conversations with them and saying, what would this look like if we just return this land to the community as it should be? And thankfully that everything fell into place, and that's what we celebrated just a couple of years ago. And what surprised me is, I was there on that particular day, is the people of the community. We did a march from the John Stewart Methodist Church to the actual site of the cemetery. And what surprised me is that the entire community of Upper Sandusky, Ohio came out. There were people in lawn chairs. There were people with their personal video cameras recording, and they were actually in tears because they knew that this was a tragic moment in history, and they somehow wanted to make it into something that they could rejoice in, that they could be happy about and say, we did the right thing. And so that was something that really surprised me as I walked in that procession. I was sitting there talking to persons that had come out on the lawn and different ones, just hearing their responses. And I was actually quite touched by that, because I think at the end of the day, that's what we all want. We all want something we can celebrate, the returning of a right relationship, the returning of land. And even this isn't the proper place, or we don't have time to even talking about returning to indigenous cosmology that will protect the lands for generations to come, where we won't do harm to ourselves and to our descendants. That, I saw, at least on this day, one step was taken to put something back into place. My hope now is that more people will begin to do that. I think in the Pacific Northwest, they too have returned some lands to the indigenous communities. And my hope is that this will become the norm, even as we begin to articulate a greater message that goes to the federal government, so that we can affirm the voices such as our relative from Hawai'i, the Kingdom of Hawaii, and saying, these are indigenous people's land, and that's where they belong to. They are the sovereign entities that should be able to be self-determinate in their territories. So that's what my hope is that we can now start articulating a voice that is stronger, and collectively we can hopefully create that change.
Thank you so much for that challenge for all of us. And we're going to now move forward into our next conversation. And these sets of questions are for Reverend Michael Yoshii. The majority of participants joining us today probably share the same experience we had in learning about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II at school, which is basically a very short paragraph tucked inside a US history book. Would you share with us in a little bit more detail what led to the internment of Japanese Americans, and what was the real cost and harm done to these persons and families forcibly removed from their homes and communities?
Sure. Thank you, Amy, and thank you for inviting me to be here. As Pastor Chebon speaks about the sacredness of land, and Minister Sue, I want to just thank you for the sharing you've done. I've been so enriched by your presence here today. And I do want to call out that I am calling in from Chochenyo land here in where I reside in Alameda, California. And I do want to honor the sacredness of their ancestral memories. I also want to invoke into the presence of this space my grandparents on both sides of my family. My photo backdrop is actually taken from the cemetery where they are buried. And my father's side was from Oakland, California. They lost a restaurant that they operated when they were sent to Topaz, Utah. And my mother's family had a farm in Fresno, California, and they lost their farm when they were sent to Jerome, Arkansas during the war. My mother is also buried in the same place as well, and I want to just invoke her memory as well and bring them into this space for today's conversation. My father is still alive. He'll be 100 years old this coming July. He was 21 when they were sent to the camps. And you can imagine he was a young man at that time. Most of that generation are now gone. So most of the people who were subjected to the incarceration are no longer living, but I really want to invoke their memories here today. So to focus in on your question, Amy, about the causes of the mass incarceration, when Congress passed the legislation apologizing to Japanese Americans in 1988, their report stated that the causes were the combination of the toxic triangle of war hysteria, racism, and lack of political leadership. And I think that it's important to understand, though, the depth of the racism that existed at that time, but also the trajectory of racism during the time of Japanese immigration in the late 1800s to this country. I want to do a little screen share to kind of help illustrate some things for us. Japanese Americans came into the country in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I think what's important to understand is that this was on the heels of the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which barred Chinese laborers from coming into the country, but also signaled the ways that overt racism was politically legalized against Asians. And ironically, the barring of Chinese labor opened up the market for Japanese immigrants, but they also faced similar racial animus once they began to enter into the workforce. And so it was labor that particularly whipped up racial animus against Japanese immigrants. And this was leveraged into political platforms. James Phelan, one-time mayor of San Francisco and a congressman, made keeping California white a consistent and defining aspect of his political platform until his death in 1930. There was the Asiatic Exclusion League formed in 1905 in San Francisco that was the first organized effort to exclude Japanese from the United States. And then following World War I, other groups such as the Native Sons and Daughters of the Golden West, the American Legion, the California State Federation of Labor, and then farm-related organizations that took up the cause of agitating against Japanese immigration. And so anti-Japanese sentiment resulted in legalized forms of racism in the 1913 Alien Land Law, which prohibited Japanese from purchasing agricultural land. And then the Anti-Asian Immigration Act in 1924, which barred further immigration from Japan. So there's a series of legislation that codified racism. And here's a news clipping of when the 1924 anti-Asian immigration bill became real. So, but despite discrimination, Japanese Americans who remained in the country began to develop farming, flower markets, and small businesses. In many places, they established Japanese Japantowns with communities anchored by civic organizations, and many of them had religious institutions, both Buddhist temples and Christian congregations. And they had to lean on one another for economic survival because they were cut out of mainstream economy for the most part. These kind of codified laws kind of had these ways of excluding Japanese from different neighborhoods. And you can see how this kind of pre-existing racism shifts as the U.S. Went into war with Japan, and Japanese Americans became vulnerable and conflated with the enemy, even though they were all residents of this country, and 2/3, the Nisei second generation children, were citizens. And we can see that the racism that pre-existed for decades against the Japanese formed this toxic formula with political and economic interests, and the hysteria of being at war subjected Japanese Americans to this experience of mass incarceration through President Roosevelt signing of the Executive Order 9066. This was the notice posted by the Wartime Civil Control Administration. People notified to be rounded up, media adding fuel to the fire. And then you can see how labor was also involved in this political orchestration. The closing of shops, closing of businesses. I'm gonna stop the share there. And so Amy asked also about the impacts, the harm that was done to people. And regarding the harm that was inflicted upon Japanese Americans, I always remember redress advocates using the metaphor of collective rape in terms of what had happened to our community. And there's no question that Japanese Americans as a whole community experienced a collective trauma that's very, very difficult to quantify and or to measure. But that trauma was part of a collective consciousness, and that each individual and each family also experienced the trauma that continued to endure through generations. I know that I inherited that trauma myself, and I've spent years of trying to understand many of those factors in terms of my own personal life, and as well as the life of my family. And then, of course, there are different circumstances and contexts for each individual in the family. But of course, these are the psycho-spiritual impacts that we continue to live with today. But then, of course, there are the more tangible, concrete losses of property, of businesses, of homes that are also difficult to quantify. And just as important were the losses of the entire communities. As we've recently commemorated the destruction of the Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans destroyed neighborhoods in larger cities as well as smaller towns where everything, businesses, churches, temples, organizations that constituted a neighborhood were all decimated with the execution of a single presidential executive order. And so within this context, of community life being decimated, there was also the cultural life that was decimated as well, because things that reminded people of being Japanese were subject to vulnerability. And so the attack upon our culture also was something that people had to live through, but then hopefully recover once the experience was over and people began to resettle. I think one of the things that we can't measure is to quantify all the ways in which people have been impacted, even though redress was finally provided.
Thank you so much. A follow-up question. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, which granted reparations to Japanese Americans. How long after the internment ended did the fight for reparations begin, and how did it find its way forward? Was it met with resistance, and in what form or forms?
Okay. I think it's helpful to understand that the trajectory for the campaign for redress and reparations emerged in the 1970s. And historically, if we think about where Japanese Americans are at following the wartime and people coming back after 1945 to their communities or being scattered across the country, families were focused on resettlement and survival of their families, finding employment and ways to be employed. And in the decade of the 50s can be seen then as a period of resettlement and reestablishment for our communities. And this is also the era in which baby boomers were born, like myself, who were not incarcerated, and a new generation. Although some were born in camp of that third generation, what we call Sansei, but it's parallel to kind of the American phenomenon of the baby boomer generation. And the civil rights movement in the 60s and the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War and establishment of ethnic studies on college campuses really created a new sensibility of racial empowerment that set the stage for the idea of reparations for Japanese Americans. And the third generation did become a catalyst for the idea of redress as community groups began to commemorate the issuance of Executive Order 9066 in what were called Days of Remembrances, or on February 19th of every year. And that date became kind of a flashpoint for people to come together in communities to remember the history, or to even begin to reteach the history, and then bring Japanese American communities together for renewed racial and cultural empowerment. So with redress and reparations, there was three significant organizations that began to take on that vision of redress. And one was the Japanese American Citizens League, which was a longtime civil rights organization in the community that had key relationships with in Washington, D.C. Then there was the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, or NCRR, that was formed as a grassroots organization to raise community consciousness and engagement. And then the National Council for Japanese American Redress, or NCJAR, took on redress in a different form as they began to work on a campaign for a class action suit that went through the courts. And so after much lobbying in Congress in 1980, it was during the end of President Jimmy Carter's tenure that he signed legislation to create what was called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, or the CWRIC. And this commission was appointed to conduct a governmental study of the Executive Order 9066, the related wartime orders, and their impact upon Japanese Americans on the West Coast and Aleutian Islands. And as the commission was established, they began to schedule hearings in cities across the country where there were significant Japanese American populations residing there. Between July and December of 1981, the commission held 20 days of hearings and received testimony from approximately 750 witnesses. Through the outreach done by NCRR, I had the opportunity to testify at the San Francisco hearings and also served as a volunteer for them, actually to reach out to churches, to bring out people and to testify. The commission continued to examine archival materials through December of the next year, 1982, and then they finally compiled their findings into a report, which was named the Personal Justice Denied. And that report became the basis for the congressional legislation that was passed called the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The Civil Liberties Act issued an apology to Japanese Americans, along with $20,000 redress for each surviving victim of the wartime incarceration. NCJAR's class action suit was dismissed by the court shortly after the redress bill was passed in Congress in 1988. And during that same decade, there were the Supreme Court cases of Hirabayashi, Yoshii, and Korematsu that emerged as well. And that also added to the visibility of the Japanese American history and redress movement as well. When you asked the question, Amy, about resistance, there was obviously resistance. There was some resistance within the community. Of course, within the community, you had different approaches and looking at how this was to be accomplished. And there were many who were very reticent, particularly my parents' generation, about wanting to bring this up again, you know, in terms of the community. And there was a lot of hesitancy for many of them who had just kind of put their heads down and wanted to survive and had felt that they had kind of made it through that difficult chapter. And so I think there were generational struggles within the community around that. There were struggles among different organizations as well in terms of strategies, of course, but I think that would be a common thing, that you're going to have different kinds of perspectives on how things can be accomplished. But you also had the resistance from the general public as well. And I remember being on a radio show at one point, and there were very vitriolic callers calling in to really with unabated racism about how this should not go forward and why it should not go forward. And there are actually some organized attempts of the groups that organize themselves to show up in places to stop the Regis movement from taking place. But by God's grace, it moved forward. And in 1988, that Civil Liberties Act was passed.
Thank you so much. You mentioned briefly just the call for churches and congregations to be part of the redress. Can you share a little bit about what role the church played during 1942, 1945 when Japanese Americans were being interned, and what role the church played in the fight for reparations and redress?
You know, I think one thing that's very good for United Methodists to understand is that for Japanese Americans, there were Japanese American congregations pre-existing the wartime experience, but we were in a provisional conference. It was called the Japanese Provisional Conference, much like we've had other segregated conferences. The Japanese were segregated in their own arena. Frank Heron Smith was the district superintendent for the Japanese conference on the West Coast. And he spoke up a lot for Japanese Americans, but sadly, the church did not follow suit. And the Methodist Church didn't do a thing to stop the incarceration of Japanese Americans. The one group, faith group that really came to the aid of Japanese Americans was the American Friends Service Committee that visited people in camps, that also developed programs to help people who were coming out of camps to get education and formed scholarships for people and opportunities. And so we think about the failure of the church to support people in their time of need back then. And I feel it so much as Pastor Chebon talks about the role of the Methodist Church in the genocide of Native Americans. And so I think we need to own up to that. But I do think that there was some rectification as the Redress movement moved forward in the late 70s and 80s, that churches did get involved in that aspect as well. And that there were ways in which denominations, not only Methodists, but other denominations as well, came to support the resolutions that were being put forward for redress and reparations. And in fact, NCJAR came forth through the leadership of a Methodist, William Horry. And Reverend Lloyd Waukee was very involved in NCJAR as well, who's been long passed away, one of my mentors and people I look up to, very much involved with working within the UMC system to bring forward resolutions for that particular iteration of redress. I think it's important for us to understand too how, like in times like this, how do we support congregations that are going through something of this magnitude? And so during the wartime, churches were shut down. There were people who were assigned there to be custodians of congregations, but there were no worships going on. And post-war was a very important period of resettlement. So Japanese American congregations in many respects became hostels for people who didn't have places to live. And so many congregations opened up the doors for them to be able to have people come and stay there temporarily. And also, I think the resettlement period of reopening of churches was a very important time in which there was a very strong depth of what congregational life is within a Japanese American setting. And I think there is much to be learned even from that history that I think younger pastors are learning now within the Japanese American congregational settings and the Japanese American caucus. But they're doing a really great job now under the leadership of Karen Yokota Love, who's a pastor at Blaine Church in Washington and the chair of the National Japanese American Caucus, of really understanding this history and continuing to bring out the stories of what has taken place within the congregations. And I think it's a really important piece where, as Pastor Chebon was talking about recovering history, we're still recovering history and we're still learning of stories of what things people have gone through in various congregations and collectively as well that can inform our larger body and add to the conversation, particularly around collective work on anti-racism.
Thank you so much for your answers. We're going to now move to happening in Evanston, Illinois. And these set of questions are for Reverend Grace Imathiu. Earlier this year, Evanston, Illinois became the first city in the United States to offer reparations to descendants of slavery. Can you share with us the process Evanston underwent to arrive at this decision, and what are the reparations being made and offered?
Mhm. Thank you so much, Amy. First, let me say I am not an expert in this area at all, and I have jumped into this conversation on reparations and become involved in reparations, having found from reading the history of the church I serve, First Church Evanston, that the first recorded Black resident of Evanston, Maria Murray, is in our records as having been a probationary member here at First Church. And having found that when she moved here in 1855, she had been bought out of slavery and came to Evanston as an indentured servant to one of the members of the congregation who was a Sunday school teacher, Mr. and Mrs. Vane. So I felt very pastoral that this is something that had happened to someone who was a member of mine. And so I then became really interested in what was going on in Evanston. A quick background for those who don't know where Evanston is: it's a suburb of Chicago, an interesting city because it was founded in 1850 by John Evans and a group of Methodists who came to this part of the country, of this city, to found a city where they could build the Northwestern University. So it was founded by Methodists, named after a Methodist, and they also then began what would become Garrett Theological Seminary, and then also the church. So Evanston has got so many. I wanted to set the stage on how having Methodist roots. This whole reparation began back in 2019 when one of the aldermen, Robin Rue Simmons, who grew up in Evanston at the age of 43 as an alderman, sent an email asking that the commission, the Equity Commission, would join her in exploring what she called best actions in pursuing the light at the end of the tunnel. And she explained that reparations makes people uncomfortable. Interestingly enough, by the November of that year of 2019, she had already garnered enough work for there to be a proposal for reparations. And this past March, then the City Council of Evanston voted 8-1 to distribute $25,000 each to 16 eligible Black households to use for home repairs as down payments on property. The funds come mostly from a new tax on legalized marijuana, and Black Americans were seen to have been disadvantaged by racist housing decisions. And so to be eligible for this $25,000, a resident must be a Black person who has lived in Evanston between 1919 to 1969, or a descendant of such a person. And the family must also have been a victim of discrimination in housing because of policies or practices in the city at that time. Evanston has pledged $10 million over a decade to go towards reparations.
Thank you so much for just giving us the details of what reparations looks like right now in Evanston and its policies. How has Evanston First United Methodist Church, where you are the senior pastor, been part of this reparations movement? How did the congregation come to support this? And what insights can you share with churches that are wanting to support similar movements in their communities?
Only 1% of our congregation is Black. And so as the senior pastor in a cross-cultural and cross-racial context, I must admit I was really anxious. I was afraid my congregation, my white members might just melt down into guilt, which gets us nowhere. So one of the first things I had to really work on with a group of members is, for me, I felt strongly that Maria Murray, a member of our congregation, the first Black member of Evanston, whose home is was in the white side of Evanston, that we had a buy-in that way. This was a personal matter, that one of our members was involved in this. So we began to explore what it meant to have this member of our congregation in 1855 who had lived in Evanston for 46 years, is buried right next to the other members of our congregation, Mr. and Mrs. Vane. What it meant that her home is no longer a space where Black people own homes. Because in 1919, we began to see how there was redlining in Evanston, so that the Black population was moved into a triangular zone bounding the Black residential enclave located in the city inner core. And that zone was tagged for disinvestment. There would be no development of schools, parks, playgrounds, libraries, or grocery stores. That was in 1919. And since then, that discriminatory reality has been so that Black people live in Evanston in a very particular place. And the home that Maria Murray lived in is no longer available to Black people. So this past Easter, during Lent, we began midday services on Wednesdays that would explore the history of our congregation and the history of Evanston. I was also learning along with everybody, so I was learning quite a bit, and decided that since the city council had said they would give $25,000 to each anyone who qualified, we would raise $25,000 during Lent and Easter. And I was so amazed that we've been able to raise $50,000 that we're going to be able to give to the Reparations Committee to be part of our donation as a congregation. With God's help, this will not just be a one-time thing, but it's something we can do annually. And also with God's help, this is not just about money, it's also learning our history and our part of the story.
Thank you so much for providing such an answer that I think a lot of clergy can probably relate to in considering and thinking about speaking to their congregation members about getting involved. One question that we have, recently there's been some criticism coming from oppositional voices. One example is the Evanston Rejects Racist Reparations, speaking out against reparations in Evanston. And we're wondering, has the church responded? How is the church responding in the midst of these conversations?
the church has not responded. That is a complicated conversation. There are some who actually show us that perhaps that voice is not an Evanston voice. There are other voices from elsewhere that are entering our space. So we're being really aware of that. The one voice that has spoken, has not supported reparations, are those who have suggested that reparations in Evanston is becoming nothing more than a housing conversation. So that's one of the places that we're still in conversation. Is this nothing more than a housing matter? So that's where we are at.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So we have one more question for our panel discussion. This is for all of our panelists. And the question is, there has been growing energy around federal reparations for descendants of slavery, especially regarding the passing of HR 40, which is to create a commission to examine its merits. What are the connections and parallels that you see with reparations for your community and the federal reparation for the descendants of slavery in the US? And what are some lessons and strategies that can be learned and shared? And it can go to anyone.
I can share just a little bit, Amy. As I understand it, HR 40 will set up a commission similar to what happened with Japanese American Regis and Reparations movement. And in fact, there are Japanese Americans, myself among them, who've sent letters of support for HR 40 to the Judiciary Committee to parallel what had taken place with Japanese Americans as well. I know there are some people who don't feel like there should be a study commission, but there should just be straight out redress granted. But that was the parallel discussion that happened in Japanese American community as well. And the idea of having a commission did prevail in that particular movement. And I think that's what's before us in HR 40 as well.
Thank you. If anyone else would like to respond. Anyone? Well, thank you so much to our panelists for this rich conversation. We're going to jump right into the Q&A portion, and Reverend Katie Monforte will lead us in that time.
Thank you so much for all the panelists who are here today for sharing so much depth to the history and context that shed light on the stories of your communities and families that you represent. Many of the questions that were asked throughout this conversation, you guys have actually answered through your in-depth analysis and historical bridging. So thank you very much for just engaging our audience. They're really active and really enjoying this conversation. The one question I'd like to ask all of you is that many of you named the generational trauma that has impacted your communities. What steps can we take towards healing, repair, and restitution? And that question is for everyone. So I will start with Reverend Chebon. Would you please address that first?
Yes. I would have to side with my relative, Reverend Grace, because I don't feel that I'm an expert as well in some of these conversations, but just by virtue of kind of the work that we've done, we've been kind of drawn into it. When we think about how do we respond to this trauma, or the things that our communities have gone through for generations now, my hope is that there would be, number one, some type of acknowledgement from entities outside of our community. That's going to be the biggest thing. One of the things I shared with our denomination was when we start to explain what we've gone through historically, what we've seen our grandparents go through, what we've seen our parents go through, we sometimes relive what they had to go through. It becomes a difficult task, it becomes a burden. And so my hope is that, we can kind of, hold on. I have a pet who has now come in my room, my office here, trying to take over my computer. That there can be some type of corporate investment in recognizing what is it going to take to begin to put the pieces together collectively of traumatized, historically traumatized community. And some of that is places where we can start reinvesting into the salvaging of indigenous languages, the piecing together of indigenous spiritualities. All of these things that were demonized in the development of this country were the things that we use to help take care of our entire existence, our will to live, our understanding of our place in the cosmos, our understanding of how we interact with our elders and our children, and even how we interact with this earth mother that we live upon. So by taking steps to be investing in, this community knowledge that's still there is what my hope would be. And that would be, there's also a parallel to that, because as scary as this is, we're still unearthing the truth. And as much as I'm skeptical on reconciliation, truth and reconciliation commissions, I really think there needs to be one all across the board for the development of the United States to recognize where have these various areas of injustice and trauma taken place, because we're seeing the same entity harming various communities all across the board. And this isn't a history that we can find in the history books. We're just now finding out. We mentioned the Tulsa race massacre that, here I'm in Oklahoma, so that we just recognized the 100-year anniversary. They too are doing their own examinations of mass graves that have not been documented in the area of Tulsa, Oklahoma. So finding out all of these things that we've gone through that have been hitting, I think, is vital. Even though it can be a time-consuming process, I really feel like an investment in that will help bring us to a step of affirming our place in existence in this world.
Thank you, Reverend Siobhan. Reverend Grace, do you have any insights to offer us on places of repair, hope, and healing?
I think for me, as a pastor of a local congregation, the work of remembering is the work we are now doing, because remembering is so very painful. And so the work of remembering is just as far as I think we're putting our toe in the river of remembering. And then for me, the work of exorcism, of what it means to allow ourselves to be freed of this evil, this demon that even dictates how we see each other, how we treat each other, how we hear our stories. So we are now, I think, in the work of remembering.
Thank you. And then Minister Leon-Sue, what would you offer us? And you're muted. Could you please unmute?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. As I mentioned, the Hawaiian Islands were illegally annexed in 1898. In 1897, there was a petition that was taken in Hawaii to oppose annexation. And 90% of the people of Hawaii opposed annexation and wanted the kingdom restored. But this was ignored by Congress, and they went ahead. Actually, it wasn't ignored. It helped to stop the ratification of the Treaty of Annexation in 1897. But in 1898, like I explained, the United States went ahead with with another measure, a resolution to go ahead and annex Hawaii. Because the surviving population in Hawaii right after annexation was still very, very conscious of the fact that they were opposed to the annexation. Then the United States undertook, with the help of the territory of Hawaii and the insurgents that had taken over, undertook a very heavy indoctrination program. That is, they used, Hawaii actually had a stellar educational system. We had a public education system that was second to none in the world. And so what they did was they changed the curriculum and made it a very heavily American-centric curriculum. And so everything was taught about America, and everything about Hawaii was ignored. And the idea was you start with the children, and generationally, you start to erase the memory of the Hawaiian Kingdom and of the Hawaiian culture and things like that. So the language was banned from use in the school. Previous to that, all the education was in the Hawaiian language, but now it's changed to English. And then, of course, the history was changed. A high school, the foremost high school in Honolulu was changed from Honolulu High School to President William McKinley High School. And so these types of really deliberate efforts were to change the consciousness and the national consciousness as well as the cultural consciousness of the people of Hawaii. And it succeeded quite well, to the point where I, growing up in the 60s, going to school in the 50s and 60s, didn't hear a single thing about what happened in Hawaii. All we heard was Hawaii was a kingdom, and one day the Queen decided we better be part of the United States, and lo and behold, we became part of the United States. That was the narrative, and everything else was left out. So we began to slowly relearn our culture, and part of it had to do with regaining or rediscovering our language, and rediscovering our art, the arts, the music and the dance and things like that. The hula had been really bastardized for commercial purposes by Hollywood and by the tourist industry in Hawaii. But we began to find the deeper parts of hula. So what we did was, it was the culture and our rediscovery of the culture and the rediscovering of the accomplishments of our predecessors, of our kings and queens, and really in the ancient times, the voyagers that went over this vast Pacific Ocean in boats made of wood and leaves and settled all the islands in the Pacific 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus was born. And here we were celebrating Christopher Columbus Day and had no idea our own ancestors were these tremendous navigators, and they had built a culture here in Hawaii that was what we're talking about, sustainability. It was a thriving, sustainable culture, and it served the people. So that whole history was lost to us. So there was a traumatic disassociation from who we were. But fortunately, since the 70s, we've been really building that up, and we've turned the corner in which we've become very conscious about who we were and who we are and what we can be based on what our ancestors have contributed to our society and to our culture. And so there is this upswing right now because of the regaining of our identity, which had been stolen by the United States. So much of it, the healing part of it is kind of we've entered that ourselves, and we're working on it. And it's a bit kind of difficult at places, particularly because we're disadvantaged by the economic system and things like that. And like I said, we're on the lower levels. We're high on the lower levels of like incarceration, homelessness, economic status and things like that. But our people are beginning to come together. Now, one of the things I wanted to say was that, like I mentioned, the UCC had apologized in 1993, and we saw very little actual change in that. But now there is a measure that's going before their conference to sort of like bump that up and say, what can we really implement as acts of repentance? Now, a few years ago, when the Methodist Church had this period or this time when they had established this acts of repentance commissions or committees in various districts. So I was in conversation with the Methodist Church, and we talked, and they wanted to do a similar apology to what the UCC did in 1993. So I helped them in drafting something because we wanted to focus on the real injury, not just on the superficial injury. And so they drafted a resolution, and it was passed by the district conference. And then I said, well, great, now we can start talking about acts of repentance, or what kinds of acts of repentance. And they said, well, we have submitted it now to the general conference, and they're not meeting until 2020. So I said to them, I said, do you mean you're not going to enter into any kind of repentance or formulate something that can go into effect right now? You're going to wait until 2020? And they said, yes, well, that's how we do things. And so even though the local church has said we need to begin acts of repentance here in Hawaii, they're waiting for approval from the General Assembly. And of course, COVID canceled the General Assembly meeting last year. And so this has not actually formulated. Anyway, so what I guess what I'm saying is that one of the things that we need to do is if we are talking about an apology and a desire to repent and to make restoration and reparations and things like that, the church needs to go to the people and talk to them. The conversation needs to take place with the people. When I entered the scene, when they were considering this apology, they had not even talked to the people. This was an internal church thing. And I kind of barged my way in and said, wait a minute, you're leaving out some essential things that concern the people. So, but the church has a tendency to keep everything in-house and not actually go to the people and look at what's going on and actually formulate their responses and their actions according to what is needed. Now, the Friends, Chebon, you brought up the Friends. Yeah, excellent. They are a great example of looking at what needs to be done and serving the people in that way. So that's what I have to share.
Hello, Minister Leon, for sharing just the call to reclaim identity and some of the steps that local UMC churches are taking to act. And then last but not least, Reverend Michael, thank you for evoking your ancestors and making this a very personal conversation. Where do you find hope for repair, for healing, and restitution, knowing very personally the generational trauma of this conversation?
As I think about the subject of trauma and healing and restoration, I think about how the Regis movement for our community was a trigger in a way for the suppressed memories that many of my parents' generation in particular had, because many of my grandparents' generation were already gone by that time. But both the hearings that were held across the country and also when the legislation was passed and it was announced, it became a trigger for people to say, hey, this really happened. Both the legislation happened, but people that were hearing and listening to the stories of our community. And so rather than that legislation being the closing chapter of restoration of justice, it to me was kind of an opening chapter for more that was to come. And so what we began to see was a plethora of history projects that were started after the legislation was passed, and people beginning to even talk more about their stories, even up to this day. And as I mentioned, most of the people who were subjected to mass incarceration are now gone. My father is going to be 100 years old, and he's probably in the middle of that kind of age spectrum of those who were in that generation. So there's very few that are still left. And what I'm seeing happening is younger people taking up the mantle, my children's generation, who are trying to understand their history better. And I love what Sister Grace mentioned about remembrance, that our time of remembrance is not over, it's a continual one. and that as people continue to tell the story, they also continue to excavate new pieces of history that maybe were lost either through congregational history or family histories. And so that process continues on. And I believe that in that aspect of it, the process of remembrance is an ongoing one, and the healing is ongoing as community engages. I also liked what Sister Grace was saying also about exorcism, and I believe if we understand this theologically to be one in which we address the sin of racism, that our healing is bound up in the continual work of working for anti-racist measures, both within the church and in our society and as the globe around us as well. So there was unfinished business, even though our community received its redress. There were the Latin Japanese Americans who were not granted redress that continue to fight for their unfinished business that many of us in Japanese American community support. And then of course, others here represented in this webinar today have unfinished business that you are pursuing. And so I think for our community that has received some modicum of justice, part of our healing is about being involved with the healing of other communities now. And that understanding that our healing is bound together, and that the liberation of one is the liberation of all, and that the principle of the indivisibility of justice is so important for us to live out. And particularly from a theological and spiritual standpoint, that we cannot be free until everyone is free. And so in that respect, our charge continues, for this notion of healing and repair for all people.
We give thanks for the truth-telling that was shared here and the ongoing work that you all are committed to, and the prophetic vision that you remind us to live into together.
Thanks, Katie, for the Q&A time. Again, a sincere thank you to all of our panelists, Minister CU, Reverend Yoshii, Reverend Kernell, and Reverend Imathiu for being with us today and for sharing your passion and dedication, the work of uncovering truths to remembering and sharing these truths, and the work for justice. And thank you so much for the reminder that we are all bound together, that our liberation is tied to each other. So thank you so much for being with us today. As we come to the close of our webinar today, 2 short announcements regarding the next webinar series. Please join us next Thursday, June 24th at 1 p.m. for the 3rd installment of our webinar, Reimagining. Our guest speaker will be the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, the Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary, and we'll be hearing on the theological and biblical perspective for reparations and how we can prophetically live into that calling now and also into the future. Our rescheduled first webinar on remembering will be on July 19th and that's on Monday at 1 p.m. And our guest speaker will be Professor Earl Lewis, the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American African Studies, and Public Policy at University of Michigan. He is also the director of the Center for Social Solutions, also at University of Michigan. This webinar series hopes to provide knowledge and insight into a more just future of acknowledging wrongs and redress, but that just future is possible only with action. As mentioned, HR 40 is currently awaiting floor action right now. So we ask that you contact your member of Congress today and ask them to support HR 40. And you can do that easily by just picking up your phone and scanning the QR code on the screen. That will take you directly to the Take Action page located on our website to do just that. The link will also be included in the follow-up email to this webinar. For our closing, our General Secretary, Reverend Dr. Susan Henry Crow, will offer a blessing. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Susan, for our closing.
Thank you all so much. This was so inspiring, and I've learned so much, and I cannot thank you for all that you have given me and given us this day. we do come on this almost Juneteenth day, and that commemorates the end of slavery in the United States. I think that President Biden will sign a declaration today, making this a federal holiday. So we await his signature. So we remember that there are things to rejoice, and there are many things to continue to remember and to repair, and that Christ leads to healing with our help. So hear now these words of blessing from Scripture. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. And help the suffering. Honor all people. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Blessings to you all.
Aloha.
Aloha.